During World War II, many significant events happened, and one of them was the Japanese-American internment camps. This was caused by an order put out by the U.S. government. The order was called Executive Order 9066, which allowed the U.S. military to remove anyone or anything from any area. The order was placed in late February after a devastating attack from the Japanese. The Japanese Americans were soon removed from their homes after the order was announced and placed in internment. 2 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, one of the U.S. government's naval bases in Hawaii was bombed by Japanese planes. This naval base was very important, as it served as a military, maintenance, and supply hub. The U.S. was expecting Japan to invade Southeast Asia instead, but they were wrong and suffered for it. The attack was brutal on the U.S. government's military supplies, crippling them by destroying many of their battleships, planes, and so much more. Many lives were lost, and American citizens were afraid of getting caught in these battles. The U.S. had not participated in World War II, but rather stayed on the sidelines, supplying their allies with what they needed. But with this attack, many of their supplies had been destroyed, and after careful consideration, the U.S. and their government had decided to join in World War II. Not long after the bombing, the U.S. and its citizens gained raised suspicion about Japanese Americans because of the attack. The U.S. government and its citizens were quite paranoid about a betrayal attack from Japanese spies, so President Roosevelt signed an order called Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, which stated that the U.S. military was allowed to remove anyone or anything from an area. Although nothing on the order mentioned removing specific races, the U.S. military targeted Japanese Americans. The U.S. began putting up poster warnings about Japanese Americans and how they would be put into internment camps. They had about 1 week to take everything they could carry, so many of their belongings would be left behind. The Japanese Americans were forced into these internment camps, having their rights of freedom violated by the U.S. government. They also had rights of speech, but those were violated too, as they weren't given a chance to protest. This was not their only problem, though, as American citizens were using posters and public media to promote Japanese racism. They depicted the Japanese as weak and inhumane, with monstrous features like sharp teeth, and some even compared them to rats. After packing, Japanese Americans would be loaded onto buses. Instead of being taken straight to the camps, Japanese Americans were taken to relocation centers or even dusty horse stalls to stay until they found a camp ready for them. Though the relocation centers were just a temporary place to stay, most people had to wait about 6 months until they were transported to a camp. Inside the camps, Japanese Americans were split up and put into about 504 barracks, each barrack fitting about 8 Japanese Americans. These barracks were small, and there was little or no privacy inside them. Also, there was no way to get out, as the camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences and watchtowers with guards watching all day and all night. The guards in the watchtowers were very serious about the Japanese Americans escaping, so serious that they would kill anybody who came close to the wire fence. The Japanese Americans inside were labeled by numbers, as if they were inanimate objects. Many tried to connect to their ancestry by doing things like art to keep calm and sane. Although the camps were terrible, many people found peace in arts like painting, poetry, and more, getting rid of their stress and worries. Camp went on like this for a while until eventually, small jobs like farming opened up for people, and small makeshift schools were created. Over time, things started to change and become like normal life, with newspapers, places of worship, bands, shops, schools, sport teams, and more. Many internment camps developed like these, and life went on like this in the other camps, placed in California, Idaho, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. With the U.S. now in the war, Germany and Italy became enemies as they sided with Japan. Although they were enemies, little to nothing happened to people of German or Italian descent in the U.S., showing the racism behind the internment. Even when proposed with the idea of interning German and Italian Americans, the U.S. government declined and ignored the proposition, saying that the German and Italian Americans were not a threat to them or the country. After some convincing, the U.S. had decided to intern only some German and Italian Americans instead of all of them like the Japanese Americans. Though German and Italian Americans were interned, their internment experience was much better, as they were sent straight to the camps. Also, their experience in the camps was much cleaner and better, having better housing and much more privacy. The internment camps were then taken down in 1944 when World War II ended, freeing the Japanese Americans. Although being free from internment, they weren't free from their problems. Japanese racism continued, and the belongings the Japanese Americans had left behind were either vandalized or stolen by people. Because of these actions, many Japanese Americans had nothing to return to. When trying to get somewhere to stay, like at a hotel, the Japanese Americans would always get the worst conditions. Many Japanese Americans also got psychological issues because of the camps. The entire internment experience was traumatic, especially on children and young adults who were still developing into who they were or who they want to be. Soon, the U.S. confirmed that the Japanese Americans were completely innocent and did nothing wrong to deserve internment. Despite these facts, some Americans still chose to be racist against Japanese Americans, completely denying the truth. Many Japanese Americans were infuriated after the internment, and some even tried to fight back. Some people, like Fred Korematsu, tried to fight back in court, and some left the U.S. for Japan in frustration. The internment even sparked some debate in other parts of the world. Almost 40 years after the camps were shut down, President Ronald Reagan and the U.S. government released an apology about the internment to the remaining Japanese Americans who had experienced it. They apologized about how they violated the Japanese Americans' rights, and how they made them lose a lot of their belongings, and that the U.S. was responsible for it all. It was a deep apology about the injustice of the internment and how they violated their rights. They even gave them enough money for reparations of the belongings they lost back then. This apology also mentioned the racism behind the internment, as many Japanese Americans did nothing and they had locked them up with terrible conditions, unlike the German and Italian Americans. The U.S. was truly sorry about this injustice, and the apology was very formal. In short, the entire event was a tragedy. For the Japanese, their rights to freedom of speech, religion, and movement were taken away. Other rights like equal protection and the right to due process supported the fact that they should have never been imprisoned abruptly. Not only did they lose rights, they also lost their homes, properties, belongings, and their dignity. In the end, the discrimination and internment that the Japanese Americans faced was wrong, but it still took over 40 years for the U.S. government to acknowledge this injustice. The U.S. government had a responsibility to protect the rights of every one of its citizens during World War II. Even the Japanese Americans. Despite this, the U.S. ignored their own responsibility, acted out of suspicion violating the rights of Japanese Americans, and didn't take responsibility for it until 40 years later.